I'm going to read a story that for about the last 8 years or so was broadcast every Christmas season on WYPR. And this year, the programming didn't work out so that they would air it, so I thought I would read it to you all this evening. And it takes place in this neighborhood, like almost all of my stories do. And it's about a guy who is a lot like me, who is wandering down the alley one day and sees his aged aunt, Aunt Lola, in her kitchen in her house coat. Anybody here know what a house coat is? Oh, I mean, actually, if you just want to go out on Eastern Avenue, you might see a couple right now trying to cross the street against the light. And in the spirit of the moment, they renew a family tradition that had gone down to embers, and they sprinkle some magic holiday dust on it, and it lives again, which is what I try to do in my stories. Danny's stories are far afield; they're global, and I tend not to write beyond. Like somebody said to me once, "You'll drive to California, but I can't get you to come to like Hyattsville." I'm like, "No, not going to Hyattsville."
We'll find a way.
So this is called Aunt Lola, and it's about the making of a very famous Italian waffle cookie called pizzelle. The gate to Aunt Lola's yard hung limp on broken hinges. It was closed with a piece of rope. And Basilio let himself in from the alley and walked over cracked concrete to her back door. It was nearly dawn on Christmas Eve, stars fading into a gray, cloudy sky. He had a sea bag of gifts over his shoulder. He paused before knocking, staring in as Lola moved around the kitchen in her housecoat, sipping coffee. She didn't hear him when he rapped lightly, so he watched a moment more. Post-war metal kitchen cabinets were thick with brown paint and decals of horses. She had an old Oriole stove, a tank without a thermostat, next to a top-of-the-line Kenmore refrigerator, a bereavement gift from her kids when their father passed away the year before. On the wall, next to a 1-week left-in-the-year calendar from Our Lady of Pompeii, was a studio portrait of the original Bombaci sisters, Mary, Stella, Anna, Francesca, Amelia, unsmiling in old country sepia, before dispersal to orphanages, servants' quarters, and inevitably, America. During the Great Depression, when being poor meant nothing more than not having money, the sisters had populated the alley with children, a score or more of first cousins that included Basilio's father and Lola. Now Basilio and Lola, whom he called Aunt out of respect, were the only ones left in the 600 block of South Macon Street. The rest were dead or scattered in a grass-is-greener hopscotch that began in an alley once known for homemade wine and rose bushes before they skipped to Dundalk, and then Rosedale, and then White Marsh, and now out to the God-forsaken subdivided pastures of Harford County. Lola's children had tried for a year to get her out of the house, and Basilio, who made ends meet painting seafood on the sides of refrigerated trucks and didn't own a car, sure wasn't hiking out to Falston just to celebrate Christmas Eve. Lola came to the door and pulled the curtain, her face creased with lines he'd drawn 1,000 times over in his sketchbooks, wisps of his grandmother, gentle to the point of naivete, alive on the other side of the glass. She squinted, recognized him, and unlocked the door as he plucked something from his bag, the satchel immediately lighter by half. "Hey, hon," said Lola. "What you doing up so early?" "I'm giving out presents," he said, stepping into the warmth of fresh coffee, dishwater, and oil heat. He held a heavy, long-handled cookie iron in front of her and said, "This one's got your name on it." In the long moment, that Lola puzzled over the well-worn contraption, Basilio realized that he hadn't been a boy for a very long time. And no one put out shallow dime-store dishes of celery dribbled with olive oil and black pepper anymore before holiday meals. And Lola said, "What is it? What is it?" Lola felt around on the top of the washing machine that stood between the door and the sink, and she found her eyeglasses and said, "Good God, I ain't seen one of them in many a year." As she poured coffee for him, Basilio opened the flat jaws of the pizzelle iron to show what was engraved there: the miraculous medal of our Blessed Mother on one side and a busy weave of diamonds on the other. Miraculous, a floral M in a constellation of petitions, the initial interwoven with a cross surrounded by 12 stars. 12 stars, a dozen men on the road sowing truth no one wanted to hear. Truth, spare parts and broken hearts in an East Baltimore kitchen nearly 100 years after their ancestors had found warm beds, full plates, and simple work in the shadow of a great bottle cap factory. "Where'd you get it, kid?" "Where do you get anything in the third world nation of Baltimore?" laughed Basilio, from some dummy who didn't know what the hell it was. He set the iron across a newspaper on the table, yesterday headlines confirming his cynicism, and he looked around the spotless row house. Catholicism, a lesser devotion than prayers said on your knees with a bucket and a scrub brush. Aunt Lola didn't have a tree, but carols were playing on a plastic AM radio, and she taped Christmas cards to the spokes of the banister in the middle room. "What the hell am I going to do with a pizzelle iron?" she said. "Hang it on the wall?" And just before Basilio could say that that wasn't such a bad idea, hang it on the wall, put up a small shelf and light some candles, something better occurred to him. "We're going to make pizzelles," he said. "I don't know how, hun." "How hard can it be, Aunt Lowell?" "I turned many a pizzelle iron," she said, "but one of the cousins picked up on the recipe, not me." "No one wrote it down?" "We didn't have to write it down," she said, "so nobody did." "We can do it," he said, drumming his fingers across the plastic tablecloth. "I watched them do it. You watched them do it every year. Eggs, sugar, flour, butter, just like everything else." "Well, we got plenty of sugar," she said, "but baking powder, baking soda, I don't keep that stuff around anymore." "The store does," said Basilio, and he got up to peek in the fridge, empty except for a small carton of milk, a big jug of water, and 2 meatballs in a dish. Her fridge was an expensive nightlight. "There's some vegetable oil in the cabinet," she said, "but the main thing, said Basilio, is the anise." Lola moved to a roll-top hutch, Pennsylvania Dutch stenciling on the lacquered wood, and found a crusty brown medicine bottle, bone dry. "Don't let 'em give you extract, it's too weak," she said, handed him the bottle. "Oil of anise, just like what you're holding there." Lola went for a change purse, but Basilio was already at the door, a good year of selling tacky paintings to tourists behind him. On crab shells, he had painted Mr. Bow throwing a baseball, Mr. Bow scrubbing marble steps, Mr. Bow eating steamed crabs. They ate that stuff right on up. "I'll be right back," he said, picking up his bag on the way out the front door, counting the houses as he passed them, and remembering who used to live there. Mr. Kugler, the German, who made beer in his basement, put on lederhosen to hike in Patterson Park, and was head chef at the bottle cap factory when it employed 1,000 people. Miss Helen, a tough Polish lady who shucked oysters in cold packing houses on Boston Street, worked as hard as any man, and would tell you without being asked, "We didn't have no women's lib in them days. We just worked." His grandparents' house was in the middle of the block, and he remembered the Christmas Eve 40 years earlier when he'd lost a flying beetle doll, John, above these tarred roofs, a toy he enjoyed for a moment before it disappeared into the cold night sky. How he cried, never imagining that a couple of miles down the salty river would find him living on Macon Street himself, the way his widowed grandfather had before him, alone. 2 blocks up, he hit Eastern Avenue and turned left toward the old Chessie Underpass, built in 1930 when the factory was supplying millions upon millions of crimped, cork-lined crowns to bottlers around the world. A train rolled by as he walked beneath the trestle, and he stopped to absorb the feel of it, remembering stories of Depression-era kids being sent to pick up loose coal to throw in pot-belly stoves, cheap coal that burned dirty and every now and then blew up a house. The train passed and he moved into the Highlandtown shopping district, reaching into his bag to give away a baseball cap, the mighty cartoon bird orange, freshly laundered and smiling, to a young boy young enough to be happy about it. He gave a repaired rosary to a Salvadoran woman pushing a stroller with 2 kids in it. He laid a little holiday Feliciano on her, and she smiled. He unloaded everything he had in the short walk from Aunt Lola's to Di Pasquale's. Sometimes during this annual ritual, passing out unwrapped oddities that people would have stepped over if they hadn't been presented as gifts, he'd see the very thing he'd just given away, a plastic action figure or a ball with a few bounces left in it, a redistribution of something more impossible than wealth, lying in the gutter right next to the spot where he'd just given it to the kid. At Di Pasquale, around the corner from the Zunino funeral home, where his grandfather had been laid out, Basilio ordered a double espresso from the girl behind the counter and drank it down, his duffel no longer a St. Nick sack but a grocery bag, as he grabbed what he needed and resisted the urge to linger. At the register, he took out his little anise bottle from Aunt Lola and asked if they could refill it for him, the way Lola said they did back when you got anise at the pharmacy. Studying the bottle like an Indian arrowhead, the cashier chuckled and handed it back to him with a clear plastic bottle of anise, just as small, $5.95. In Basilio's wake, someone was buying ricotta and someone was getting hauled out to a hearse. On an opposite corner, Mr. Stan was selling last-minute inventory at his custom foam shop, pierced hearts and holly for the cemetery and twinkling lights for fake trees. One goes out, they all go out. I got it, said Basilio, and he walked back to the house without knocking. The kitchen table was covered with wax paper, and an empty aluminum spaghetti pot sat on the corner. Aunt Lola was leaning up against the washing machine, counting on her fingers. I think I got it too, she said. It'll all come back to me when we start working the dough. She cracked a half dozen eggs into the pot and tossed everything else in after them, pouring out a couple tablespoons of the anise oil, Basilio holding the pot steady as she leaned over it with an electric mixer, the beaters nicking the edges. And then she took a dab of dough, fashioned a small cross from it, and stuck it on the back of the stove where they'd see it as they worked. My mother always did that, she said. For luck, I guess. Basilio turned a knob on the stove and put a match to the front burner. The oven, as old as the railroad underpass, bought at Balwicki's and already in the house for years when Lola moved in on her wedding day. The iron lay over the open flame. Good and hot, said Lowell. It's got to be good and hot. And soon she was dropping small balls of dough between the scored jaws of the iron. The first few were pale prototypes, trial and error, and an almost good one for every 3 that weren't right at all. Let me try, said Lola, taking the iron and dipping under the weight of it. My God, she says, it's heavy. Basilio held her wrists in his own hands. They were soft and pudgy, like the dough, and he helped her turn the iron. They made a keeper and flipped it onto the wax paper, the cookie flat and crisp and light brown around the edges, the M raised in perfect legibility. The day had worn Lola out, and she sat down, pooped. I'm going to rest my eyes a little bit, hon, she said, moving to the couch in the front room, a crocheted pillow under her head. Just going to rest my eyes for a couple of minutes. And that minute was all it took for Basilio to get the ambidextrous hang of making the cookies by himself, as though the iron and the dough were brushes in his hand. Open, plop, squeeze, long enough to say a Hail Mary, turn it over, sing a verse of God only knows, open, pluck, repeat, 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 as Aunt Lola breathed in the warm aroma, the licorice scent of the anise perfuming her dreams. Awake, we recognize and remember the mystery of more than 10,000 smells through 1,000 genes and 1,000 receptors. They come together the way letters make words and words make sentences. Asleep, that gift multiplies, and the receptors that told Lola pizzelles were piling up in the kitchen had bonded into the shape of a teardrop. Science promises that in the future, smell may be restored to those who have lost it, a day when appetite, fear, and longing will be giving back to people unable to follow their nose. But until that day, 2 dozen pizzelles on the table, 3 dozen, 4. As pictures moved in Lola's gray head, Glimpses of a trucking company at Foster and Oldham Streets when it was still a pasture, the day when her mother unwittingly burned up the rent money by hiding it from her alcoholic husband in the oven. Basilio turned the iron and stared out into the alley. Out there in the weeds and litter, he saw moments when he'd been taken into small, dark bedrooms crowded with heavy furniture and crucifixes large enough to plant on Calvary. Vanity tables turned to altars for sick old ladies as the Bombaci sisters fell away one by one. He could never remember their names. He could never tell the difference between Aunt this one and Aunt that one, the room smelling of death and Noxzema, as the aged brushed their hair below 3D collages of the Sacred Heart, frames of bleeding butterfly wings that scared and transfixed a boy no taller than the post at the end of the bed. And the old ladies would say to him in broken English, "Come here, kid. Let me look at you." For taking 5 small steps from the foot of the bed to the head with a little nudge from behind, for letting his cheek be touched, Basilio would get a quarter. Remembering what a long, hard road those steps had been, he decided that when Lola woke up, they would retrace those steps together. A couple of hours later, Lola found the table crowded with cookies, the aluminum pot rimmed with crusts of dried dough soaking in the sink. "Good Lord, how long was I sleeping?" she said, nibbling the edges of a pizzelle. "What are we going to do with all these cookies?" "Give them away," said Basilio. "Sounds good to me," she said. "I slept good." They packaged the cookies in deco tins Lola found in the basement, dusty things that once packed Getz's caramel creams, SK sausage, and Utz potato chips, old drums she rinsed out and layered with the last of the wax paper. As Basilio passed her stacks of cookies for the tins, Lola counted them. 4 dozen, 5 dozen, 6 dozen, 7 dozen, just like I thought we'd get from those amount of eggs, she said, eating another cookie as Basilio picked up the phone and called for a cab. "Where are we going?" asked Lowell. "Falston," said Basilio. "Falston," laughed Lola. "Wait till they get a load of us. Should we call and let them know we're coming?" "Nah." The cab honked outside, and they walked out the door. Lola in front with 1 tin, Basilio behind her with 2 more, his sea bag empty on the kitchen floor, and the cold, sharp, and late afternoon sky heavy with the possibility of snow. "I dreamt the bottle cap factory was on fire again," she said. "That cork burned for a week when we was kids. Didn't think they'd ever put it out." "Well, it's going to be new again," said Basilio, telling the cabbie to ride by the factory on the way out. "It's going to be new, just like the old American Can Company over in Canton." "Oh, yeah, Canton, for sure. Everything's new over in Canton, but not here." "I'm just saying, Aunt Lowell, hold on to your house. It's going to be worth a lot of money." "Where the hell am I going to go?" she said, a month away from her 75th birthday. "I'm going from here straight to Zanino's." The cab turned for the interstate, over the river and through the woods, with pizzelles warming Lola's lap through the bottom of the tin. Thank you.